The boardroom on the 42nd floor of RavenTech Industries had never felt so suffocating. Floor-to-ceiling windows displayed the glittering skyline, but inside, the atmosphere was heavy with failure. 10 of the country's most celebrated engineers, men and women with awards, patents, and decades of experience, sat in exhausted silence around a polished glass table. On the massive screen at the front of the room glowed a single number that made everyone uneasy: $300 million. That was the projected loss if the company's flagship AI security platform couldn't be repaired within 72 hours. Investors were circling like sharks. Competitors were waiting to strike. And CEO Daniel Whitmore, a man known for bold acquisitions and fearless decisions, was staring at a problem that refused to be solved. The system had crashed after a critical update, locking out thousands of global clients. Banks, hospitals, and even government contracts depended on RavenTech's software. Every minute offline burned millions. Daniel had hired the best consultants money could buy. 10 experts. 10 brilliant minds. 10 expensive failures. "We've tried every patch," one engineer muttered. "The core architecture is corrupted. It doesn't make sense." Daniel's jaw tightened. It had to make sense. Code always made sense to someone. Downstairs, far from the tension of the executive floor, in a narrow maintenance corridor that smelled faintly of cleaning solution and warm circuitry, worked a quiet janitor named Miguel Santos. He pushed his cart slowly, humming under his breath, his worn shoes squeaking slightly against the polished tiles. Most employees barely noticed him. To them, he was background noise, the men who emptied their trash and wiped their fingerprints off glass walls after midnight meetings. But Miguel carried more than mops and buckets. He carried pride. He carried sacrifice. And most importantly, he carried two small reasons to keep going: his twin daughters, Sophia and Sarah. The girls were only 12, but their minds were sharp in a way that startled even their teachers. Miguel couldn't afford elite private schools, but he could afford books, second-hand programming manuals, discarded tech magazines from the office recycling bin, and an old laptop someone had thrown away because it was too slow. At home, in their tiny apartment, the twins would sit side by side for hours, studying code the way other children studied cartoons. They didn't just memorize syntax, they understood patterns. They saw logic like a puzzle begging to be solved. That evening, Miguel had no choice but to bring the girls to work. Their school had closed early due to a plumbing issue, and he couldn't leave them home alone for his overnight shift. "Stay close to my cart," he reminded them gently as they stepped into the glittering lobby of RavenTech. The girls nodded, eyes wide as they looked around at the towering screens and futuristic displays. To them, this wasn't just an office, it was a kingdom of ideas. While Miguel worked floor by floor, the twins sat quietly near an unused workstation in an open development area. The main crisis team was upstairs, but several engineers downstairs were still attempting minor diagnostics. On one of the monitors, lines of green code scrolled rapidly. Sophia tilted her head. "That error loop looks strange," she whispered to Sarah. Sarah leaned closer. "It's repeating because the input validation fails before the authentication handshake," she murmured back. They weren't guessing. They were reading. Hours passed. Upstairs, the 10th expert finally leaned back in defeat. "We need to rebuild the entire framework." "It'll take weeks," he admitted. Daniel Whitmore felt something inside him snap. Weeks. In weeks, the company would be finished. He dismissed the experts for the night, frustration burning in his chest. As he stepped into the elevator to clear his mind, he didn't realize destiny was waiting 3 floors below. Meanwhile, downstairs, one exhausted engineer left his station to grab coffee, leaving the corrupted code open on his monitor. Sophia hesitated. "We shouldn't touch it," she said softly. Sarah nodded, but her eyes didn't move from the screen. "I just want to see something." They didn't hack. They didn't break in. The system was already open. Carefully, they examined the log files. Within minutes, they noticed something all 10 experts had overlooked: a minor time synchronization mismatch between regional servers that triggered a cascading encryption failure. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't flashy. But to minds trained to see patterns rather than prestige, it stood out like a cracked tile in a perfect floor. "Look," Sarah whispered, pointing. "The timestamp offset. It's off by exactly 0.42 seconds. Sophia's fingers moved gently over the keyboard. They created a simulation patch, nothing permanent, just a test environment. They rerouted the authentication sequence through a corrected time protocol and reinitiated the handshake. The error loop stopped. The system stabilized. On the screen, a quiet message appeared, connection restored. At that exact moment, Daniel stepped out of the elevator and walked past the development floor. He froze. The massive error dashboard displayed near the ceiling flickered from red to yellow. Then yellow to green. His heart pounded. Who did that? He demanded sharply. Engineers scrambled back to their stations, confused. And then they saw them, two young girls sitting at a workstation, eyes wide, hands hovering nervously above the keyboard as Miguel rushed forward in panic. "I'm so sorry, sir," Miguel stammered. "They didn't mean any harm." Daniel didn't speak immediately. He walked closer, studying the screen, reading the patch notes Sophia had typed in the comments. It was elegant. Minimal. Precise. "Explain what you did," he said calmly. The twins exchanged a glance. Sophia swallowed. The servers weren't synchronized. The encryption kept failing because the handshake relied on identical timestamps. Sarah added softly, "So we created a correction layer instead of rebuilding everything." Silence filled the room. One engineer slowly sat down. Another leaned closer to the monitor, disbelief washing over his face. Daniel Whitmore felt something shift inside him, not just relief, but recognition. Genius doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it wears a pink hoodie and nervous braids. "You solved a $300 million problem," he said quietly. Miguel looked like he might faint. "Sir, they're just kids," Daniel raised a hand gently. "No. They're visionaries." Within hours, the system was fully stabilized using the twins' solution as the foundation. Clients were restored. Investors were notified. The stock price, which had begun to tremble, steadied. But Daniel wasn't thinking about numbers anymore. He was thinking about opportunity. The next morning, instead of a press conference about failure, RavenTech held one about innovation. Daniel stood at the podium, cameras flashing. "Last night," he announced, "our company was saved not by experience alone, but by perspective." He invited Sophia and Sarah on stage. The world watched as two janitors' daughters shyly stepped into the spotlight. Daniel then did something no one expected. Effective immediately, he declared, RavenTech is launching a fully funded education and innovation program for underprivileged young minds. And Sophia and Sarah Santos will be our first scholarship recipients and junior innovation consultants. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Miguel covered his face, overwhelmed. The bold move wasn't charity. It was investment. Daniel understood something powerful: talent is everywhere, opportunity is not. By the end of the week, RavenTech's story had gone viral. Not just because a $300 million crisis had been solved, but because two young girls had reminded the world that brilliance can rise from anywhere. In their small apartment that night, Sophia and Sarah sat with their father, staring at official scholarship letters and new laptops provided by the company. "Does this mean everything changes?" Sarah asked softly. Miguel smiled through tears. "Yes," he said. "But never who we are." Across the city, Daniel Whitmore looked out over the skyline again, but this time, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. He had nearly lost everything because he relied only on titles and reputations. Now he understood that leadership isn't about knowing all the answers, it's about being bold enough to recognize them, no matter where they come from. The twins didn't just fix code. They rewrote the company's future. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that greatness can come from the most unexpected places, then stay with us. Subscribe to this channel for more powerful stories that inspire courage, reward brilliance, and prove that no dream is too big and no background too small. Because sometimes, the biggest breakthroughs begin with the smallest voices.